It is our pleasure in the Saudi Economic Association to organize this important symposium, which will discuss a lively topic entitled Diversifying the Saudi Economy, Challenges and Path Forward. Three very distinguished speakers who have broad knowledge and deep experience in the issues at hand. Before we begin the symposium, allow me to give a brief introduction about the Saudi Economic Association, especially for our colleagues from outside the kingdom. The Saudi Economic Association has or is considered one of the oldest scientific associations in the country, which was established in 1985 by a decree from the Scientific Council in Saudi University. The Saudi Economic Association is a non-profit organization. Membership is open for all those who are interested in economics from the kingdom and abroad. Hence, it is membership is flexible and not limited only for. In addition to inviting specialists for brief discussions in person or virtual, the association holds meetings and conferences. Also, it publishes research and articles related to economics and its. Since its establishment, one of the association's several objectives as a scientific association is to have productive actions like this with Arab and international economic organizations, as well as experts who share the same. Last but not least, the Saudi Economic Association aims at broadening its consultancy role in public and private entities, which would enhance its potential to function as a think tank, providing advice to those who are interested. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Timothy Callen, who is going to give us a macro view of the topic. Tim holds degrees in economics from the University of Essex and University of Warwick in the UK. Tim also has very wide work experience. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf State, Washington, focusing on research and analysis of Saudi and other GCC economies. He's also a consultant in the World Bank in the Global Prospect Vision, focusing on research on key trends in the world economy. Tim's past work experience includes being the mission chief to Saudi Arabia and division chief for Gulf Cooperation Council countries in the Middle East and Central Asia Department. He used to be a senior advisor to Saudi Arabia Executive Director for the IMF in December 2021 until November 2022. In the late 80s, or say in the 80s, Tim worked as an economic analyst at the Bank of England, providing input into the bank's economic forecasts and analysis of real and monetary issues. In the 90s, he became a senior economist at the Reserve Bank of Australia, conducting economic research on the Australian economy. A very long CV for Tim, but we make short of it. And Tim, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you to the Saudi Economic Association for inviting me to participate in this event. It's an honor to be here on the screen with you all. And I'm going to open up, as Dr. Ahmed said, with a pretty macro view of progress with economic diversification in Saudi Arabia. I'm going to just go through a few slides. Okay, first problem, I can't, there we go. Excellent. So I just thought I wasn't completely sure in terms of the audience in terms of the level of knowledge. So I thought I would just maybe give a quick overview of the what and why of diversification. And, I guess if I was to define economic diversification, and I'm sure people on the call and my fellow panelists may have different views on this, but I would define it as being the process of shifting an economy away from a source of income or a particular sector towards relying on multiple sectors or multiple sources of income. And you could also define it as trying to move away from reliance on a single country to multiple countries as your source of income. So for example, some islands may be very reliant on the US as a trading and income partner. So diversification in their case would be trying to move to have bigger trade or financial relationships with a country other than the US. Why is diversification important? I think, basically it's because relying on a single source of income is risky. If that source of income dries up entirely, then your economy is going to be in trouble because you have no other source of income. If you're, for example, in the case of Saudi, traditionally the economy's been reliant on oil. Oil is volatile. For example, we've seen, even in the last couple of years, prices from $100 a barrel down to around 70, but we saw even more extreme movements just going back a decade ago. And of course, questions exist, may not agree with how climate change is going to affect the demand and supply of oil in the future. But there is undoubtedly some risk to the global oil market from climate change and how economies will look to mitigate and adapt to that impact. How to measure diversification? I think probably the most common, in my view, useful way is to look at export diversification, and again, various ways of doing that. But you could also look at output diversification, government revenue diversification, and even employment diversification. I'm going to go through each of these measures in the following slides. And when to measure. I think this is actually a really important question because I think in Saudi, there's a tendency for a lot of people to say, well, Vision 2030 started in 2016, so let's measure any progress relative to 2016. But in my view, that may be a bit misleading because at that point, oil prices and oil revenues more generally were pretty low after the oil price slump that started in late 2014. So I think you may well risk underestimating progress because if oil prices are low, naturally you're likely to see greater non-oil exports or revenues as a share of the total in those years. So in my view, what you want to do for comparison, and I try and do in some of my charts, is choose years where oil revenues were broadly comparative and then try and look at progress with diversification across those two relatively comparative years. So Saudi Arabia, I mean, as you all know, and I can quickly skip through this, but there was a challenging starting point. I think if you go back a decade ago, Saudi Arabia is very dependent on oil, still is. Most countries have diversified away from oil, and often here, the usual examples of Mexico, Indonesia, Malaysia were never dependent as Saudi Arabia is and was on oil. And those countries are already seeing reserves of oil decline. So in a sense, there was a bigger incentive to move away. For Saudi Arabia's perspective, oil reserves are still very high. There are many, many years of production still there. At least at face value, you can make the argument the incentives are really, sort of more limited to move away from oil. Second, Saudi is already a wealthy country. Oil exports have made Saudi Arabia wealthy. Got good infrastructure, income levels are fairly high. A lot of the countries we usually look at who've been able to, at least industrialize rapidly, maybe Korea, Thailand, China, Vietnam, started off as low-wage economies and gradually built their way up the value chain. Saudi Arabia is already at a level where you're clearly not going to be doing low-wage, low-productivity work, at least for nationals. Oil wealth is traditionally skewed incentives. I think, traditionally, I think people were more attracted to employment in the public sector. That's clearly changed. And companies also, tended to want to seek government contracts, often in non-tradable sectors. So, the bottom line is the many deep-seated structural challenges to overcome. And here I haven't mentioned things like, what on international measures looks like, at least at an average level, relatively low educational attainment. And again, going back, a decade or so, half the population in terms of the female population were really not able to participate that significantly in the economy. Again, that's changed. My view on Saudi policy approach, maybe 5 areas of main policy levers: deregulation and reform. And again, this very well, so I won't go through the examples I put here, but second thing is strengthen fiscal revenues. Third, build out traditional infrastructure. And I was in Riyadh actually for the first time in 5 years in January, and I have to say I very much enjoyed riding the new metro system, which is clearly the one of the new examples of the build out of infrastructure. Massive public sector investments in tourism, entertainment, sports, and maybe overlapping all of these, the giga projects in general. And then what I would say, sort of more traditional industrial policies in terms of tax incentives, subsidies, direct investments to try and attract industry, whether it be, goods or services into the kingdom. So how do we assess progress with diversification? Let me show you a few charts. And, just in summary, this is showing you snapshots across 4 years, 2018 in red, running across to 2024 in black. And as you can see on measures of non-oil exports, share of total exports, and here I'm looking at exports of goods and services, we've seen progress in terms of a more diversified away from oil export base. Non-oil GDP similarly has moved more towards non-oil. Perhaps the area of biggest change for the government, the non-oil revenue share in total revenues. And then I've also showed as and this is I think harder to define, but in terms of thinking about diversification in terms of the labour market, the jobs held by Saudis as a share of total private sector employment. And this is actually one where we did see change, improvements through to 2022, but with the big influx of expatriate labour in the last couple of years, that has actually declined again. If we looked at a different measure, which would be, I guess, the share of total Saudi employment, the Saudis working in the public sector, that has actually declined and has continued to decline. So, mixed bag in terms of the labour market, but on the other measures, I think progress has been made. And here, the next few slides, which I'm just going to go through very, very quickly, just show a bit more of a time series and a couple of different measures in terms of export diversification. output diversification. And again, these I think are somewhat susceptible to my earlier criticism that you might be comparing here periods when oil revenues were very high with oil revenues being very low. So they may not be perfect measures, but they still give you an idea of the trend in these. And then similarly, with the time series of government revenues and the employment indicators, and here again I have the Saudi workers in the private sector, which does show continued improvement. And hopefully, from my point of view, sharing this PowerPoint at the end with everybody who's attended is absolutely fine. So if the Economic Association is willing to do that, I'm happy for you to have these slides. So let me just briefly talk about challenges and risks to diversification. There are 2 points I want to make here. The first is what do you need in terms of being able to create new industries that are going to be competitive internationally? And I think what you need is, there are many things you need, but one thing you need is basically a productive labor force where the wages being paid are in line with the productivity of the individuals. And I don't think that is the case at the moment if we look in terms of average levels. This is stealing a figure from actually, so it is a little out of date, from 2019 from the IMF staff report for that year, which shows the relationship between the annual average wage and productivity across economies. And basically, if you're above the dotted line, you're, I would say, competitive in terms of your wages. If you're below the dotted line, you're not competitive. And that is, showing that Saudi plus most of the other GCC countries are not competitive in terms of wages. So I think at the end of the day, what needs to happen here is for reforms to boost productivity, given it's unrealistic to think that wage levels themselves are going to decline. If you can't get productivity in line with wages, then I think at the end of the day, you're going to be subsidizing for, ever more the industries that you're trying to create in the kingdom. So I think that's one challenge. And I know that there's a lot of effort going into strengthening education across the whole spectrum of the educational system, and that will clearly take time to have an impact, but I think it's very, very important. The second thing is, it's not fully clear to me that the broad macro cycle has changed significantly over the last decade or two. So while I'm sort of very happy, I think, to see the changes I've highlighted, and we can go to other changes such as a huge increase in female participation rate, many more companies coming to issue debt and equity in the capital market, so on and so on. The cycle where you have high oil prices, high government spending, high imports, pretty good non-oil growth, large inflows of expatriate labour, and consequently large outflows of remittances has not obviously changed to me. And I think that one way of looking at that is that the current account in 2024, I don't think the actual number is out yet, but it looks like it's going to be broadly imbalanced, maybe a small surplus, maybe a very small deficit, but somewhere around balance, while oil prices actually remain pretty high, around $80 a barrel on average in 2024. So that's quite unusual to see the current account at such a low level given where oil prices are. And of course, not all of that is to do with high imports and high remittance outflows. Part of it is because oil exports are relatively low because of the OPEC Plus agreement. Petrochemical prices have not done great the last year or so. Margins have been quite tight. So there are many other reasons, but I think one of the reasons is that the cycle of high oil government spending, imports, expatriate labor has still at this stage not been broken. So let me conclude. I think undoubtedly progress has been made in Saudi Arabia towards a more diversified economy. Important reforms that have been implemented over the past decade have helped support this progress. But at this stage, still, despite that progress, the economy is still primarily driven by oil revenues. Industrial policy, which the government has been following, trying to get companies like, Microsoft, various, car manufacturers, Lucid, so on into the country, that can help spur new sectors of the economy. We've seen that in other countries. The giga projects, I think, less clear to me what they will contribute ultimately to diversification, but clearly, the jury's still out on that. And lastly, and I think a really important point, is to be competitive, wages need to be consistent with productivity, which I think ultimately means, continuing to work on boosting productivity. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you for your attention and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim, for this thoughtful presentation. And now I would like to introduce you to our second speaker, Dr. Abdullah Almeer, who is going to give us more of micro view, focusing on R&D and the role of small and medium enterprises. Abdullah Almeer holds PhD in economics from North Carolina State University and a master's degree in applied economics from Washington State University. Abdullah is currently assistant professor of economics in business school at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals. Also recently, he became a consultant in the National Labor Observatory, part of the Human Resource Development Fund. His past professional experience included working as an engineer in Aramco between January 2013 and August 2015, as he holds a bachelor degree in chemical engineering from Florida Institute of Technology in December 2012. The areas of research interest cover a range of fields such as matching theory, market design, labor economics, and economics of education. Dr. Abdullah, quite good, very variety in it, and the mic and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, for this opportunity to speak in front of the Saudi Economic Association, and I would like also to thank the panel, Tim Callen and Justin Alexander. Is it clear?
Yes.
I'm just trying to show my slide. Okay, we would like to talk about diversifying the Saudi economy. I would like to thank Tim for his part. He laid out merely the macro picture. In my part, I would like to talk about the challenge from microeconomic point of view. As we know, let me just, sorry, I lost it. Yes. As we know, the Saudi Arabian economy depends on natural resources as the main source of income. However, the objective for the Vision 2030 is to diversify the economy and to increase the non-oil GDP. The government had several goals to achieve their objective, diversifying the economy. Some of them are increasing the foreign direct investment share in the GDP from 3.8 to 5.7 by 2030. Increase the small medium enterprises contribution to the GDP from 20 to 35% in 2030, and increase the non-oil GDP from 18 to 50% by 2030. To achieve these goals, the government launched several initiatives and established several institutions conceived by 2030 vision. For example, Economic City and Special Zone Authority, Research and Development and Innovation Authority, and SME General Authority, and SME Bank. In fact, to diversify the economy, there are several policies to diversify the economy. For example, macro policy, industrial policy, reformation for the education. In my part, I would like to focus mainly for the foreign investment and research and development and innovation of Saudi Arabia. What have been done post 2030 vision, and what is the way to go further. Let's just go over when there are several diversified economy. For example, the top three are US, Germany, and China. But it's good to consider, for example, if we think about China and Korea, these two nations used to be based on agriculture production in the 1950s, and now they are the top diversified economies worldwide. If we look at Korea and South Korea and what they did, technological innovation was an important element in their diversification story, with export of production, with large corporations such as Samsung, LG, and the growth for the R&D in Korea was really important. For example, in 2020, the share of R&D spending in terms of the GDP is almost 5%, which is pretty high. And there are 50,000 R&D centers with half a million people, researchers in these centers. Also, I would like to highlight that in terms of the R&D expenditures in Korea, 80% is coming from the private sector and 20% from the government, which is really important. And we can see R&D expenditures is correlated with the increase in GDP per capita. One of the best result is the Korean GDP increased from 13 billion in 1975 to 1.7 trillion in 2024. For Saudi Arabia, the ambition for the Saudi Arabian as a oil-based economy is to transform from natural resources to physical and human capital and enhance the welfare of its citizens. However, the question for our webinar is how to achieve diversification. In fact, based on economic theory or economic analysis, microeconomic analysis, the economy should shift from natural resource economy to knowledge-based economy, by a knowledge-based economy that fosters innovation, productivity, and sustainable growth. As we know, the standard goods in classical economics are rival, such as rival means if someone consumes a good, there will be lower amount for the second person, or for example, scarcity. Oil, if we produce oil today, that means there will be lower amount of oil for the following period, whereas knowledge and ideas are non-rival. As more and more people use Java programming or design the latest iPhone, there are not less and less of ideas to go around. For example, if you think about the vaccine chemical formula, if I'm the first one who create a vaccine and another person replicate the vaccine protection, then we will save millions of lives and the society will be better off. Therefore, knowledge and ideas does not become scarce as we replicate them. In fact, they achieve increasing return of scale of production, and they increase the innovation and ideas. When they turn to patents, they increase the production and increase the growth and income for the population or for the economy. So that should be the way to diversify the Saudi economy, based on knowledge-based economy that attract foreign direct investment, attract ideas, attract physical and human capital, and produce innovation and patents and goods and services to diversify our economy. Consider one of the institution that conceived by Vision 2030. The first one is Economic Cities and Special Zone Authority. As we know, foreign direct investment is important for any government economy, and free trade is very important to increase the economic growth and to accelerate diversification. And therefore, the Economic City and Special Zone Authority is the authority responsible to facilitate economic activities such as investment, trade, employment, by providing economic incentives and for these companies in different economic zones. Last year, the Kingdom launched 5 special zones in 5 different cities, 3 in the East and West Coast, and 2 around Riyadh, targeting different industry, for example, chemical industry, logistic industry, IT, light industry, EV cars. Several industry are under construction in the last 3 years in the kingdom. For example, Sear Manufacturing Complex in King Abdullah Economic City, they started the construction of the $1.3 billion facility. Lenovo and Alat, they started last month in Riyadh. And last year, the manufacturing GDP is 9.1% of GDP. And we expect it to be more based on our progress. Therefore, attracting foreign direct investment bring not only money, bring money, technology, culture, innovation, R&D. So many variables comes with foreign investment to the Saudi economy, which is very important. The second institution created after the vision is the Research, Development and Innovation Authority. Very important institution. The RDIA is an instrumental in driving the Saudi economy and shifted toward diversified knowledge-based economy. The main role for the RDIA is to encourage the partnership between government, industry, academics, and remove barriers for innovation by sharing knowledge between government, private sector, and academia, and allowing the transfer of knowledge, access of research, interaction between scientists. Then we expect the scholarly output, the research, the patent, the R&D to be increased, and with the help or with the interaction with private sector, we expect these patents to go for commercialization, to go to the market and to expand and to create businesses and to expand our economy. And I can give so many examples. For example, think about Google that came from Stanford. Computer scientist. The vaccine COVID, the research was done at University of Pennsylvania, and both scientists, they got Nobel last year in medicine. So many internet was created by the US government. So many innovation we have in our life, and so many businesses that create based on these innovation came from scientists in universities. Therefore, there is strong correlation between innovation and the GDP. The top 3 diversified economy, United States, China, and Germany, they have large number of innovation. Saudi Arabia currently in the middle. In the middle, and because we are not that diversified, but we have the capability to move forward and to take a look for the overview for the research and development output in the kingdom. In terms of research output, the publication increased from 24 to 59,000 in the last 4 years. The number of author increased from 23,000 to 45,000 in the last 4 years. So both publication and people increased by more than 100% in the last 4 years. And we expect the number to increase more in the future. In the 2021, the total R&D spending was 14.5 billion riyal. Out of this 14.5 billion, 50% from the government and 35% from the private sector. Whereas in the United States, 78% from the R&D spending is from the private sector. So to my understanding, this is the first shortcoming for our R&D structure. We should expect more spending to come from the private sector, to interact more with the R&D centers, and then to produce this patent into the market, and then to grow the businesses. Therefore, the private sector should increase their participation in R&D and innovation. The relationships between private sector or SMEs and R&D in advanced economies, OECD countries, SME represent around 99% of all firms, the main source of employment, and they generate 50-60% of value added on average. According to the SME survey report done by King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, the main challenge for Saudi SMEs was a lack of know-how and lack of expertise and low access to R&D centers. 72% of Saudi SMEs did not interact with academic institutions, which means there is barriers for interaction between SMEs and academic institutions. 80% of those SMEs needed innovation, and marketing was very demanded for commercialization of their products. Therefore, we would recommend, based on that survey, that much more collaboration between the private sector and academic institution, and we expect RDIA to fill this gap. One successful example for the Saudi Arabian R&D sector is King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, one of the best universities in Saudi Arabia and across the Middle East. King Abdullah University of Science and Technology provide a comprehensive ecosystem to transfer research ideas into patents and their subsequent marketing. In 2022, KAUST raised $145 million in startups. Just in so many challenges for the kingdoms. Just to name one of them, Ritzy Farm is an agriculture technology startup founded by two professors at KAUST, Mark Tester and Ryan Liffers. The two scientists managed to secure $15.5 million to develop a technology that grows a crop at greenhouses using sea salt water. Therefore, they reduce the water demand by 90%, which is very important for Saudi Arabia, as agriculture is very important for our economy, and we lack water in our economy, unfortunately. Considering the scholarly output in Saudi Arabia, we realize most of it is done by the academic sector. Most of the research output is happened based on the academic sector, and we would expect, and the top four are King Saud University with 35,000, then King Abdulaziz in 30,000, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology with 13,000, and King Fahd University of Petroleum Minerals with 11,500. And this is aggregated for the last 4 years, from 2018 to 2022. The numbers are growing overall by from 22,000 in 2018 to 56,000. However, as we see, the private sector has a limited contribution to the research output in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and most work is done from the academic institution. Therefore, to conclude, we would recommend more R&D expenditure from the private sector through economic incentives, for example, tax exemptions, to increase their share in R&D contribution. We would suggest to strengthen the collaboration between SMEs and academic institutions. To increase the R&D and innovation output in the kingdom, we would recommend forming an alliance between the top 4 universities: King Abdullah University of Technology, King Saud, King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, and King Abdulaziz University. If these 4 universities form an alliance, we would expect the outcome would be really positive for the research and development environment. Removing barriers between these 4 institutions will create a collaborative environment that foster the innovation and accelerate diversification for the Saudi economy. For example, if we consider the Association of American Universities, where top 60 universities, they collaborate they coordinate in terms of research and development and to share expertise, and they solve a grand challenge, I mean, for their economy, I mean. And by this, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah, for this interesting and very thoughtful presentation, especially about the link between innovation, R&D, and innovation, and also very insightful recommendations.
Thank you.
Now I would like to introduce to you our third speaker, Justin Alexander, who is going to give us a talk on measuring diversification in the GCC and the lessons learned. Justin Alexander holds economic degrees from Oxford University and the University of London. He is the director of Khalij Economics, which provides economic analysis mainly in the GCC countries. In addition to general economic analysis and policy, it has expertise in hydrocarbons, AI, capital markets, and geopolitical risks. In addition, Justin is a specialist in the carbon sector, and he is the author of the Gulf Weekly, which I encourage you all to read, which is a free newsletter on LinkedIn. Justin has engaged in the Middle East as an economist analyst since the late 90s. He served as a senior economist at Qatar National Bank and in the finance ministry in his previous role as Middle East economist at the Economist Minute. Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Is my presentation sharing for you?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you for the association for the invitation, and to Dr. Tim and Dr. Abdullah for their valuable insights into pathways for diversification in Saudi Arabia. I'm going to step back a little now to provide a wider perspective around the GCC to help inform our assessment of progress here in the kingdom. So there's a broad agreement about the main dimensions of diversification, which include production, exports, revenue, and employment, as Tim has discussed. However, there are nuances in how each of those dimensions is measured, and there are also differing views on the relative importance of them. And the impact of those choices is on display when people build composite indices that try to provide a single number for a country's level of diversification. And that's what I'm going to discuss. So the graphs here show the results of 2 recent attempts to quantify diversification. The one at the top is the Global Economic Diversification Index that was produced by Nasser Saidi for the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government in Dubai, which I will refer to as the GEDI. And the second is the GCC Economic Diversification Barometer that was developed by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a German foundation, and the Smart Investment Gateway, an economic consultancy in Oman. So the GEDI tried to encompass as many countries as possible, which rose to 115 in its 4th edition, and it therefore has to use indicators that are widely available across all these countries. By contrast, the barometer is focused only on the GCC, and this allows it to pick indicators that reflect what is important here and the data that's available locally, and to apply appropriate weights to them. So the graph here shows the latest scores from these 2 measures of diversification. The absolute numbers are not comparable between them, but what matters is the relative differences between countries. For example, both agree that Kuwait is the least diversified state in the GCC, and that Bahrain and the UAE are the most diversified, and this makes intuitive sense. Saudi Arabia is close to the regional median, which also seems fair. However, there are significant differences between the indicators on two issues. The first difference is the relative underperformance of Kuwait and Qatar. Whereas the barometer on the bottom scores them as being less diversified than the other four Gulf states, which I think is accurate, the Getty shows a much smaller gap. The other difference is over Oman, where the Getty scores it as being less diversified than Qatar. I think this result is misleading. Qatar generates almost all its revenue from hydrocarbons, and it recycles this to employ almost all of its citizens in the public sector, whereas Oman's revenue base has become more diversified, and most Omanis work in the private sector. I suspect these readings may be a consequence of the reliance on standardized global data that doesn't adequately reflect the Gulf context. That said, I also think the barometer scores Oman a little too highly, and it should probably be closer to Saudi Arabia. There is still more work that needs to be done to create a better measure of Gulf diversification, and this would be a good area of study for anyone on this webinar looking for a new research project. I actually participated in a conference in Muscat last month that discussed how to make the barometer more useful and accurate. And there were participants there from 5 Gulf states, including a Saudi professor who's probably a member of the association, Habiballah Al-Turkestani from King Abdulaziz University, as well as outside experts. At the conference, I proposed some technical improvements to the barometer, including making adjustments to some of the headline economic indicators published by Gulf states to make them more accurately reflect the underlying non-oil sector. For example, oil revenue in budgets is often understated because it is offset by fuel subsidies and transfers, for example, to Bahrain's Future Generations Fund, while conversely, non-oil revenue can be overstated if it includes taxes on oil companies. And there are also issues with diversification measures on exports and production and employment. So it makes sense to do local adjustments. So moving on, it's understandable that countries like to use indices to compare themselves with their neighbours, and this promotes healthy rivalry for improvement. However, the real value of these kinds of indices is to help track trends over time within each country in order to help understand where progress is or isn't being made, and thereby improve policy making. So these next graphs provide a long-term perspective through the backcasted results of the Getty since 2000. In the top graph, I've compared the average ranks over the 3 most recent years with those from 20 years earlier. I use an average to filter out a bit of the noise. The improvement in rank over 20 years is shown in the purple bar, where a positive number means a rank nearer to first place. The other bars show the latest 3-year average rank, and they are color-coded as before, with Saudi Arabia in red, Gulf states in black, and other oil exporters in grey. The graph is ordered by the level of improvement, and it's notable that Gulf states have made the most progress, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia both improving by over 20 ranks over that 20-year period. There are 2 exceptions, though, and it's not a surprise that Kuwait hasn't improved much. And although Bahrain's rank is unchanged, it was the most diversified in the region in 2000, and it's still close to the top. Now, the bottom graph shows the ranking time series for Saudi Arabia in red, as well as the UAE and Kuwait, above and below it. Something I found a little surprising is that Saudi Arabia's improvement mainly came between 2014 and 2017. This was partly because of the decline in oil prices over this period. It would be good to make methodological adjustments to reduce the impact of oil price volatility on diversification measures, as Tim mentioned also. It would be hard to do this for a global index like the Getty, which looks at natural resource dependency in general, not just oil, but it could be feasible for a GCC-focused index, such as the barometer. The important thing, though, is that Saudi Arabia largely held on to its improved rank, even when oil prices recovered from their low in 2016, although the impact of the oil price spike in 2022 is still clearly visible in that ranking trend. The diversification improvements in the UAE are particularly notable because they appear to be less influenced by oil prices, beginning during the oil boom in 2012 and not slipping during the oil spike in 2022. And talking about the UAE, I'm going to conclude my contribution to this webinar with a few conclusions about what has made the UAE the regional champion for diversification and what lessons can be taken from that. Its success unfortunately means that GCC diversification plans have sometimes looked a little like Dubaiification. And it sometimes seems like everyone wants to have free zones, deep water ports, a financial hub, an interconnector airline, giant skyscrapers, and other features that have been associated with Dubai's success. And there is room for copycat success in certain sectors, and good examples of this include Qatar Airways and Abu Dhabi Global Market. However, the fact that something has been replicated in another country, particularly in a large country, doesn't mean that it's going to work everywhere, and it's best for countries to play to their own relative strengths. However, there are several lessons from the UAE that I think are broadly transferable to other countries. Saudi Arabia is already doing all of these to varying degrees, but it's still worth pointing them out. The first lesson is what I'm calling regionalism. The UAE's federal structure has contributed to its diversification story. If it was a unitary state, then Dubai, Sharjah, and other Emirates might have just lived off the wealth generated from Abu Dhabi's oil fields. They have certainly benefited from that wealth in many ways, but they've also had the motivation to forge their own paths. This governance structure, combined with the vision of Sheikh Rashid and others, spurred innovations since the 1980s that laid the foundation for Dubai's success and encouraged other Emirates to find their own niches. The lesson I'm suggesting taking away from this is the importance of spreading development across a country, taking advantage of what each region has to offer, and creating local wealth and employment. Oman has been trying to do this in various ways, and last year even launched a Governorate Competitiveness Index to spur investments across the country. Regionalism has also been part of Vision 2030 from the beginning, and important initiatives to do this include the Red Sea tourism projects, the ASEER Regional Development Authority, and the special economic zones that Dr. Abdullah discussed. Although there is much that is positive in these efforts, my impression has been that over the years, Riyadh has become more central to the kingdom's economic plans than it was back in 2016. The capital city is always going to be important, but Riyadh is not well located geographically, including in relation to water sources. And the impact of the development boom has resulted in major problems with congestion and prices. Rental inflation is running at 18% in Riyadh, but is close to zero in most other cities. Therefore, my point is that some of the investments going into Riyadh might be better focused elsewhere. The second lesson from the UAE is the importance of a good environment that attracts business, investment, and talent. The UAE remains the regional leader, and this has been central to its success in diversification. However, Saudi Arabia has caught up significantly in recent years, which is something I wrote about for the association's quarterly bulletin in December. The kingdom has become among the fastest climbers in global indices in terms of competitiveness, innovation, talent attractiveness, and other areas. Nonetheless, there is still more to do. The final lesson is on the role of sovereign wealth funds. I believe they have a critical role in helping Gulf states prepare for the energy transition, and I've written a chapter about this for an upcoming book edited by Tim's colleague, Robert Moglianicki. One diversification tactic with sovereign wealth funds is to invest surpluses abroad and generate income. If the income from Kuwait Future Generation Fund was included in its budget, which it isn't, it would suddenly become the most diversified country in the Gulf, at least on the revenue dimension. Norway has a fiscal rule limiting the income it draws from its petroleum fund, and some Gulf states also draw on their funds, although in less structured ways. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has chosen not to receive dividends from the Public Investment Fund in order to allow it to grow and invest domestically, which I think is the right decision. In Abu Dhabi, there are various sovereign wealth funds with different functions, and one that is particularly relevant for Saudi Arabia is Mubadala, which was founded back in 2002 and has played an important role in developing sectors such as manufacturing and healthcare by deploying capital and partnering with foreign companies. The Public Investment Fund is emulating this approach, and even Kuwait has spoken about launching a local development fund. So whether sovereign wealth funds are investing at home or abroad, their ability to choose wisely will be one of the main factors influencing the success of national diversification efforts. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to questions and feedback. And thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Very informative. And before opening the floor for our audience, questions and comments, I would like to take the leverage of being the moderator, if you don't mind, and ask a question. I'd like to address it to Abdullah, if you don't mind. With the changing economic landscape towards a knowledge-based economy, which you mentioned in your presentation, especially towards the digital economy, how we can get the highest value added from investing in the new economy and innovations, which is mostly, as we know, is capital intensive, and at the same time promoting more employment, especially among Saudis. How can we settle in these two?
Yes.
dilemma?
In fact, when transitioning the economy from oil-based to knowledge-based economy and transitioning the Saudi economy manufacturing sector, including the AI, the technological progress will definitely negatively impact the employment in some sector. For example, let's say the manufacturing sector, the constructions. Some sectors will be less dependent based on the employment, so the employment will expected to negatively impacted in these. However, the technological progress will add more sectors to our economy or more jobs to the people, such as green technology, environmental, fintech, e-commerce. All these growing sectors will increase the job for the employment within Saudi Arabia. For any technological change, some sectors, the employment in some sectors decline, but the workers change their skills and they move for other new sectors. So we expect e-commerce, environmental and renewable energy to be a hot topic for employment for Saudis in the future.
Actually, we have questions from both the fans. We'll take one of them toward Dr. Tim. But before that, any people who has questions in the audience, they can just raise hands so we can give them the chance. This is actually a written question from Dr. Abdullah Al, KSU. He states that given the significant progress Saudi Arabia has made under Vision 2030 to diversify its economy away from oil, what do you see as the most critical unaddressed challenges that could hinder the efforts to achieve diversification? This question is for Tim.
Good. Thank you for the question. I think to me the biggest challenge going forward is really securing higher productivity growth. I think this goes back to Dr. Abdullah's presentation, and also broadly to the point about continuing to improve the education system in Saudi across all levels. But I think longer term, you're trying to develop these new industries. Yes, I think government involvement up front can be important in developing those, but at the end of the day, you've got to have industries developed that are competitive, either competitive to export into other markets or to replace imports in your domestic market, and to have that when it's going to be the target is private sector led growth. That's going to require higher productivity growth than we've seen in recent decades, not just in Saudi Arabia, but across the Gulf region more generally, where TFP, total factor productivity growth, has been pretty weak or negative for many years. So I would say highlighting and continuing to work on strengthening the education system. I think Dr. Abdullah's statistics are certainly very encouraging, but I think it's not just at the top level you need this. You need to be improving sort of across the whole board, the younger education, high school education, and then into universities. And then secondly, also the spending on research and development again, I think is is highly correlated with long-term growth across countries. So I would see those as the key challenges. Maybe one last point as well is, I think there's a lot of encouraging progress being made. I do worry that too much is being spent on large giga projects, which I think there's a large real estate component of many of these, which I worry is not necessarily productivity improving. So I think orientation more towards developing these industries of the future would be very important. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
If you
Actually, we
allow
have Dr. Abdullah.
Tim, if you allowed me, just to add, in some statistics, the output, scholarly output for the private sector of Saudi Arabia is relatively small compared to the R&D from the government. I shared it with him yesterday. So I think to diversify the economy, the private sector should contribute more and more to the R&D and development, research and development in Saudi Arabia, in terms of research output, in terms of expenditures, and in terms of innovation, and in terms of production, and making business and increasing the employment for Saudi people. That's what I'm thinking.
All right. We have with us Dr. Saleh Sultan. He's a former advisor of the Ministry of Finance. He has a comment. Go ahead, Dr. Saleh.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everybody. My voice
Yes,
okay?
go ahead.
Right? Is okay?
Yes, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is for Tim Collins. I remember when I was in the chief economist in the Ministry of Finance. I remember him. If you remember that, about 10, 13, 14 years ago, when I was with the Ministry of Finance. Probably some misunderstanding of some people, not I mean the speaker today, but I mean for the journalists, some writer, not a specialist, they confuse between diversification and deepening, because could happen diversification in the economy, but not deep. I mean, see it different sectors, but some of them not deep, almost very dependent or lack some main things. If I can consider major point is the productivity, to increase it. I wrote about something about some years ago, a long article about it, to build culture, productivity culture deeply in the schools, training from the schools in teenager years, and to the value added to be more concerned and given attention, especially in some manufacturing sector, in some industries and manufacturing especially, and with the new things to develop for the new and small companies need to more understanding on some point and voice for that, for diversification, and for to have some stronger participation and share in the economy for the regarding to the new adding, not just important build, but to depend on that. And for that about the some culture things in the society, little bit of course it is not with the economic growth, like when there's people for them some relative or some friends to give them that to be important to be given that. And we look, I wrote before that very considered improvement in the government expenditure, and that's already happened in this year, because I wrote that long time was in the Ministry of Finance was problem very things in about the government expenditure, but that hopefully that happened in GFSM and other things, because it is not to have all, but to have deepen the other sectors, because the productivity in the other sector to be much higher than what already we have, and the vision working in that. That's very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saleh. We go back to the questions, which is posed and fast. We have a question from Dr. Mohammed bin Mahfouz from King Abdulaziz University, and it is addressed to Justin. As a regional competition to attract foreign investment intensifies, what are the most effective strategies the kingdom can adopt to enhance its attractiveness to foreign investors and ensure investment flows into non-oil sector?
So thank you for the question. So I mean, I think there are lots of things that need to be done and are already being done, and you see the improvements that Saudi Arabia has made in various indices of competitiveness on various dimensions. So you can see that progress. But I should say, perhaps the most important thing, and this isn't captured so well in some of these measures, is the need for consistency and for investors to trust that even if the environment looks good now, that it will still be good in 2 years' time or 10 years' time. So that requires building up a track record, and it requires demonstrating that policies will not be changed and reversed. And I think one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia hasn't yet attracted the level of investment that it has potential for, is that it's taking time for investors to be convinced that the good business environment that's been developed in recent years will be sustained, for the duration of an investment that might take 10 or 20 years to pay off. And there's no magic bullet for that, but it's about the authorities being consistent and communicating and being transparent and building trust. And that's certainly happening, but it's perhaps taking longer than some expected. And so the speed of the growth in FDI into Saudi Arabia has not been as fast as maybe had been hoped, but the direction is positive.
Right. Actually, there is a question by Wasim Maktabi. In a way, they go along with Dr. Saleh's point. And Wasim's question is, what is the right pace for moving forward to economic diversification? Not only achieve it, but at what pace? Because speeding up may have one downfalls, or slowing down also. So there is an optimal level of speed. I will take out, let Abdullah to comment on this, because we have another question also for Abdullah, is about how can Saudi Arabia balance the need for rapid economic transformation with improvement to ensure upskills in its own workforce and attract foreign investment at the same time? If you can comment and do it two parts.
Let me start with the second one. By liberating the economy and attracting foreign direct investment, and attracting expat talents with a new Saudi generation who works in different fields, in renewable energy, in health sector, in fintech, in e-commerce. We expect the Saudi workers to upgrade their skills with the time. Think about, for example, Aramco, when it was established 100 years ago. At that time, Saudi Arabians started to enter the oil industry slowly, and now they dominate the oil and they run the business within Saudi Arabia. Therefore, I think the human and physical capital is available in Saudi Arabia. However, by opening up new sectors, focusing on the manufacturing is the key for moving forward for the Saudi economy to diversify the economy. Manufacturing is the most important, and it will, by attracting technological growth, the Saudi skills will be upgraded and the production will increase in the long run. So that's my thought, and that's as Justin said, we cannot replicate other economies' experience 100%. Definitely, each economy has its own ecosystem, its social and cultural fabric. However, we can learn from the Chinese story, or from the Korean story, or from those diversified economies. Therefore, I think in terms of education system, yes, it need to be, as Tim said, from the level 1 until the postgraduate levels. It's need more reformation, definitely, and to be upgraded. And but however, the employment will be enhanced by attracting foreign businesses, focusing mainly on manufacturing, I mean, and utilizing the Saudis' available physical and capital stock. How about the first question, Dr. Ahmed?
I think at the pace.
The pace, last year, the non-oil GDP increased by 5%. I think that's fairly good. If we look at the Saudi GDP, it increased 40% in the last 70 years. However, I think 5 years in the non-oil GDP is a good number. How fast is it? It's not important. The most important is to have continuous growth. Having a 1 year increase in the non-oil GDP and then not continuing, that will not be helpful. But the most important is to have a continuous growth for the non-oil sector.
Very good. We still call if any questions on the floor before we go to the written questions. Right. We have questions about energy. I think it's good to direct it to Justin. I have actually 2 questions from different people, but we can group them together. Okay, Amira, Dr. Amira, question. Go ahead, Amira.
I thank you so much for the great workshop. I have a question. Economic diversification has been a key pillar of Saudi Arabia Vision 2030, aiming to reduce dependencies on oil and develop other sectors with the such as tourism, technology, and manufacturing. How have the Saudi policies, including the National Industry Development and Logistics programs, and other programs such as Saudi Made in Saudi, effectively supported this diversification, and what challenges remain in sustaining long-term economic resilience?
Question is addressed to whom? Amira?
Sorry?
Who want to comment on your comment? Question?
I mean, I can have a quick go
Okay.
start, and if others want to come in. So I would say, what has contributed to diversification so far is a combination of things, right? Some of the, things have been in some ways very, very simple, right? And you mentioned tourism, clearly one of the key drivers has actually been just issuing tourist visas since 2019. So, clearly you've had, more religious-based tourism before that, but in terms of opening it up to broader tourism. And again, there's a whole, process through this of, arriving at Riyadh Airport or Jeddah Airport now relative to 10 years ago is a completely different, in a very positive direction, experience than it used to be, right? So there are these, and I hate to say they're simple because, clearly they're not simple in the decision to do it, but they're, things that, once you decided to do it, you have a system in place. It's not really costing you very much to do it. You make the change and so on. Then on the other hand, you have the much more elaborate things that are in the NIDLIB program, where you have, I think, very specific, targets trying to, say to foreign investors or domestic investors, we have these opportunities, come in, and you have a whole range of programs designed to support that. And I think there are clearly areas where you are beginning to see some progress with that, a number of tie-ups with, EV companies, data centers, technology companies, and so on. But I suspect that those are going to take, sort of longer to have an impact. And, there are questions, something like, data centers, there are a lot of comparative advantages for Saudi in that area in terms of, cheap energy, land availability. But in some sense, are you attracting people in just because you have cheap energy, which at the end of the day, maybe if that's transformed into, sort of green energy, you are beginning to diversify. But if you have the current sort of, inputs into the electricity grid, less clear to me that's the sort of diversification you're really after. So let me stop my comments there, and whether Justin or Abdullah have anything to add.
Okay, I'll go back to the question from energy part, because we have questions addressed to Justin. I will combine them. One from Dr. Adil Idris, and he asked about how do you see the future of biofuel in the Saudi energy mix under the 2030 vision. The other question is from Mashahil Al-Rataibi. With the ongoing global energy transformations and the shift toward renewables, is it possible that we will witness a boom or even a strong competition over the materials normally used in producing renewable energy equipment? And solution for this dilemma. Two parts for Justin.
So yes, thank you. Excellent questions. So on the first one about, I believe that was about biofuels. I mean, that's not somewhere where Saudi Arabia can compete, but it does. There's certainly growing competition in the energy sector. Hydrogen is one place where Saudi Arabia is contributing to alternative green fuels, which is positive. And there is certainly as the other speaker said, the other questioner said, there's definitely a demand for certain materials, partly because of the global investments in renewables and electric vehicles and so on. And I think this is one area where Saudi Arabia is and can play a really important role, because it has strong domestic mineral resources. And I think one of the successes of the last few years has been expanding beyond the kind of traditional mining activities of ma'adan, and moving into sort of more downstream refining of minerals and trading, and then the kind of the long-term strategy to bring in other companies to develop metals and minerals. So I think Saudi Arabia is very well placed to participate in that area. But I want to draw, there's some excellent questions that people are putting into the chat thread, and one which was raised by, or a comment by Ayad Al-Hudayf, who said that we need to pay attention to issues of correlation between certain areas of diversification. And I think this is whether it's trade partners or whether it's sectors, there's potentially correlation between investing in hydrogen, for example, that diversifies, but also hydrogen prices, may well be correlated to broader energy demand, and similarly, the prices and demand for minerals can also be kind of connected to the energy sector. So while these are areas that Saudi Arabia can add value, it's also useful to have diversification into sectors that are entirely different and not correlated, such as tourism. So there's a lot to be done, but these are all certainly areas that the kingdom is developing and where there is promise.
Okay, so I have also two questions from two. One is Abdullah. I will address it to Abdullah Almeer.
Yes.
It's one question from Dhikra Basmail. talk about a strategy between what we used to call export promotion versus import substitution as a strategy. And also Abdullah Ramadan asking about what are the diversification opportunities related to Al-Hajj and Umrah activities, how they contribute
Sorry,
strategy.
Dr. Ahmed, I did not hear the second question. The first one was asking about the export-import substitution strategy.
Yes, and yeah, how to choose between them and how we balance between them as well. The second, diversification opportunities, activating the activities in Al-Hajj and Umrah sectors.
Yeah, okay, very nice topic. For the first one, the most important for the Saudi economy is to diversify the export, because by entering foreign market, by sending our goods and services to foreign market, it will upgrade our skills, it will generate more wealth to the Saudi business, and it will employ more people. However, in the global economy, there are not a single economy that operates by itself. Each economy, we demand goods and services, and we exchange with other economies. However, the recent effort by the Saudi government to enhance, to allow the inflow of FDI, at the same time, to increase the export diversification. The first example is the Saudi Made. Saudi Made was a program initiated by the Ministry of Investment to brand each good produced within Saudi Arabia, and to incentivize Saudi consumer to buy their Saudi-made product, and hope in the future it will be exported to other markets. Regarding Hajj al-Umrah, Hajj and al-Umrah is part of has its own economics. I mean, people are visiting for a certain time, and it's they demand goods and services. I mean, but to think about it as a way to diversify our Saudi economy, I think the income from Hajj and Umrah is really limited compared to the wealth and to the capabilities of Saudi Arabia. The capability of Saudi Arabia in terms of oil wealth, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of other sectors, mining, as Justin highlighted, is really tremendous. So I think focusing on these aspects will accelerate the diversification for the Saudi economy.
Okay. So now we are almost 11 o'clock. Do you mind if we extend for 5-10 minutes? Just we have a couple of questions written and sent a couple of days ago. Right. We have a question, maybe it's good to address to Tim from Mansour Alrajhi. I have nothing to do with this question. He's he's asking a question regarding the increasing level of debt for consumers and corporations, and what you expect about its impact or amplification on economic growth. He didn't specify which country, but I think if you can give us some of your thought in comparison with the US experience. And especially there is another question from Al-Shambari regarding the modeling Saudi experience and what we learn from the US experience, especially regarding the debt or especially the private debt.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe let me start with Saudi and then go to the broader international experience. And clearly, Saudi, and let me start with the government sector. Debt is still low as a percent of GDP for the Saudi government and even public sector compared to almost all other countries in the world who have seen big ratcheting up in public debts in recent years. But it's also true, right, that the debt has risen, and if I broaden the definition to look at the sort of central government's net financial assets, which I would define as being its outstanding gross debt less the deposit it holds at the central bank. If you go back to 2014, that was about minus 50% of GDP. So the financial assets or deposits at the central bank were far bigger than the debt. Now that measure is something like plus 15 or 20% of GDP. So there has been a big swing, but it's still, I would say, a pretty healthy position. To be honest, I'm less up to date with what the household and the corporate debt situation is, but when I last looked, they certainly didn't look worrying from my point of view. I know there's been a big growth in mortgage debt outstanding, but that's probably a good thing given that market was pretty underdeveloped a decade ago. So I would say, in the baseline, I don't think there's anything I would worry about. What does worry me though is if you have a sustained slump in oil prices for a year or two, those debt dynamics can change quite rapidly, and I think that particularly the government needs to be careful and aware of that. If you look elsewhere, clearly governments have been, as I said, seeing large increases in debt levels across both emerging markets and industrial countries. Maybe the US isn't the best example, given there is undoubtedly a big advantage having the US dollar as the currency of the global financial system, which I personally don't see changing anytime soon. But even if you look beyond the US and look at major emerging markets, major other industrial economies, they have much higher debt levels and have much stronger pressures from demographics on the government expenditure in a broad sense than Saudi Arabia does. So I guess conclusion, debt has risen. I don't see it as a big worry at the moment, but it's something not to get complacent about, because that could change quickly if oil prices are low for a couple of years. Thanks.
Yeah. Right, there is a question, maybe a two-parts question for Abdullah. Majduleen Al-Amoudi, she is asking, how can we as a nation make the most out of public-private partnerships? Also, it's another question from Ahmed N about what is next if the role of the government still, or let's say the economy still rely on government expenditures as a considerable share of the GDP. So how can we, let's say...
Excellent question. The first one is how to increase the interaction between the government and the private sector and academia. I believe to form, for example, let's focus on R&D part, for example, between universities, the top 4 universities and the private sector, they should form a collaboration. They should, let's say, for example, we start either an alliance, strategic alliance between the top 4 universities, or there is another path to, for example, to all these 4 universities with the private sector, for example, Aramco, Sabic, Ma'aden, they all form one R&D center. And all the employees in this academic institution and this private sector, they have access to this R&D center. For example, suppose I'm an engineering teacher at KFUPM, and I need some help from Aramco or some King Abdullah University of Technology. I will have access to research and development tools or skills or lab or data or whatever through this center, by removing barriers of innovation between academia and between large corporation and small corporation, also very important, and the academic institution and the government also. It must be a part between them. Access of sharing knowledge between all of us formally is really important. That will upgrade the human and physical skills and capabilities for the Saudi economy. And I think that's really missing in terms of it's happened bilateral treatment between, for example, Aramco and KAUST, Aramco and KFUPM. But I think our capabilities is more than our performance in terms of Saudi economy.
The last question, if you like, Justin, to take, it is in the board here in the chat board from Dr. Aftab Khan. I have one question. Should Saudi Arabia develop their own country brand for the FDI and tourism? You have anything to say, Justin, to this question?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I responded also in the chat to this because I think it's a good point, and it's one of the areas that Saudi Arabia has been successful. I mean, this has been a key aspect of Vision 2030 has been to change Saudi Arabia's image internationally as demonstrating it's a welcoming place to visit as a tourist or to do business. And I think there's been a lot of success there. On the tourism front, I should say, but even my parents visited Saudi Arabia last year to go to Al Ula, and they had a great time. So I think there's been a lot of success. You've seen on the investment branding side, you've seen hundreds of companies now setting up regional headquarters in Saudi Arabia, and others considering it. So I think the branding dimension is really important and its success. But as I said earlier on, the key question is consistency. People need to trust that the brand that's being presented now will, the things will be the same in a few years' time. Yeah, hopefully that will be the case and will attract more investors and more tourists.
Right. Okay, as this very informative symposium comes to close, on behalf of the Saudi Economic Association Board of Directors and its members, we would like to thank our three wonderful speakers, as well as the great audience and those who participated in the discussion or posing questions, either in advance or live here. Thank you all. We wish you all a pleasant. Bye-bye.
Ramadan Kareem, thank you.
Ramadan
Thank
Kareem.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.